The story begins where two prisoners stand facing each other ready to fight. John throws the first punch, but right after that Nelson pulls out a screwdriver. John also brought a weapon and throws a knife at Nelson, but Nelson ducks down and avoids it. The two men rush into a struggle. John tries to stab Nelson, but the knife suddenly breaks. It turns out Nelson had hidden a stolen license plate under his uniform. John's story is quite unusual. From the age of 8 he had been going in and out of prison constantly. The first time was when he stole a truck from a lottery company, then took their giant check to a bank and asked to deposit it into his account. When the employee asked where the account was, the police immediately arrested him and brought him before Judge Biederman. Judge Biederman sentenced him to 7 years in prison and humiliated him. John said nothing, but the anger was clear in his eyes. From that moment his life of going in and out of prison began. A few years after being released, John tried to rob 2 police officers at gunpoint and even said he could kill them, but he missed his shot and was arrested. Once again he stood before Judge Biederman and was sent back to prison. At the age of 24, John was released, but less than 6 months later he was arrested again for stealing a car. The judge continued to mock him as a fool. What bothered John the most was not the sentence, but the humiliation. So when he got out of prison he decided to take revenge on the judge. He called the court to speak with Biederman, but was told that the judge had already passed away. John angrily slammed the phone and fired several shots into the phone booth. After that he walked into a bar and read an article about the judge's son. John thought if he couldn't take revenge on the father, then he would take revenge on the son. The next morning he went to an event held by the Biederman Foundation. While Nelson was giving a speech about his father on stage, John secretly went into his car, emptied all the medicine from his asthma inhaler and spat into his drink. After the speech, Nelson drove to his office. When he took a drink he noticed the taste was strange. A moment later he needed to use the inhaler but realized it was empty. The asthma attack made him panic and he had to run into a nearby pharmacy. Unable to speak, Nelson hurriedly searched for an inhaler inside the store. The shop owner thought he was stealing. At that moment John fired a shot into the air from outside. Hearing the gunshot the old man thought Nelson had a gun, so he pressed the alarm button, while his wife grabbed a shotgun. Outside, John was satisfied because the plan had worked. He believed Nelson would be arrested for armed robbery. Inside the jail cell, Nelson argues with lawyer Dwayne, but the security camera shows that he caused chaos inside the store. The lawyer says all the evidence is against him, so the best option is to plead guilty, which also means he must resign as president of the Biederman Foundation. At that moment Dwayne turns on the speakerphone and speaks in front of the entire board of directors. Everyone believes Nelson should be removed from his position. When Nelson is brought before Judge Eva, he tries to negotiate. He says his family is very rich and is willing to pay any amount of money. But the judge refuses and tells him to sit down and wait for his turn. The trial begins. After watching the security camera footage, the jury quickly believes Nelson is the robber. Lawyer Dwayne delivers a terrible defense. He argues that when watching Jurassic Park the dinosaurs look very real even though they don't actually exist, so the video might not be reliable either. However, the jury still finds Nelson guilty. Judge Eva sentences him to 5 years in prison. For the first time, John sees Nelson walking down the same road that his father had forced John to walk many times. Later John sits smoking with his friends but still doesn't feel satisfied. 2 men knock on their door to buy meth. John realizes they are undercover police but still sells to them. When they leave he tells his friends to run if they don't want to go to prison because he knows the police will come back. During the hearing later, John doesn't cause trouble. He pleads guilty and asks to be transferred to prison. The 2 men are transported to prison on the same bus. On the way, John acts friendly and asks Nelson's name and says he hopes they will share a cell. He even says if you stay near me you'll survive. When they arrive, the warden warns the new prisoners. If they don't want to get into fights then don't talk to anyone. If a fight happens don't report it. And if they see anything wrong keep it to themselves because he doesn't care. John manages to arrange to share a cell with Nelson. His goal is to turn the life of the judge's son into pure misery. When Nelson walks into the cell and sees the toilet he almost bursts into tears. John warns him that if he shows weakness the other prisoners will devour him. At lunch they enter the cafeteria. John points out a man named Leonard to Nelson, the leader of the Whites, and sarcastically says they are very nice people. In reality he is setting Nelson up. While they are eating, Leonard suddenly slams another prisoner onto the table and stabs him to death. John quietly steps aside, while Nelson stands frozen. When the guards ask who the killer is, following John's signal Nelson points at Leonard. From that moment on, Nelson becomes Leonard's enemy. Back in the cell, John pretends to scold Nelson for speaking up. When Nelson says John gave the signal, John denies it and tells him he misunderstood. A little later in the communal shower, a huge man named Barry walks toward Nelson. He is big, hairy and clearly interested in him. John steps forward and threatens everyone. "He is mine." Barry doesn't believe him, so to prove it John slaps Nelson hard on the backside and declares that Nelson is his property. Later lawyer Dwayne comes to visit Nelson in prison. Nelson begs to be released as soon as possible because he is becoming a target for other inmates. But Dwayne says Nelson has lost control of the Biederman Foundation, so he no longer has the money to continue the legal fight. Meanwhile, John spends every day turning Nelson's life into a nightmare. He pays a prisoner in the next cell a pack of cigarettes to come over and punch Nelson once every day. Even Nelson's food is mixed with all kinds of garbage. One day in the shower, Nelson is trimming his nails when Barry walks in. He looks at Nelson and admits that his weakness is men, but he loves men. Seeing Barry's interest, John agrees to give Nelson to him, in exchange for a lot of cigarettes and some contraband. In that prison it is a very high price, but Barry still accepts. John then arranges with a guard to be taken out of the cell. When the door opens, Nelson begins to panic. Barry reassures him, but right after that his men grab Nelson, pull a bag over his head and take him to Barry's room. Barry pours Nelson a drink, mocks his appearance and behaves as if Nelson is a new bride. Nelson trembles with fear. In the end, Barry says he will leave him alone today, but warns that whenever he wants Nelson is not allowed to refuse. As time passes, Nelson begins to write a diary. One day while he is sitting and writing, a member of Leonard's gang walks over and urinates directly on the diary. He only came to warn him that Leonard is about to be released from solitary confinement, and when that happens Nelson will be in serious trouble. John also says Leonard won't kill Nelson immediately. He will beat and torture him many times first. It could even last for months. The tension in the cafeteria keeps rising. John says the time to kill Nelson has already been planned. Hearing this, Nelson decides to talk directly with Leonard. John knows it is a mistake but still pretends to encourage him. Nelson walks to Leonard's table and tries to talk about reconciliation, saying that adults should know how to forgive. Leonard immediately stabs a fork into Nelson's leg. When Nelson screams, he stabs the second fork into the other leg and says now it's balanced. After that, Leonard says Nelson actually has some courage. In the past, only one person ever dared to stand in front of him like that, his own father, and he killed his father before going to prison. Nelson realizes his death is getting closer. He limps back to the table and tells John that at least his death has been delayed for a few more days. That night, John says Nelson only has a few choices left. When Nelson doesn't like any of them, John suggests causing trouble so he will be sent to solitary confinement, where Leonard cannot touch him. Before Nelson can fully understand, John throws a ball toward a guard and then hides behind Nelson. When the guard walks over, John suddenly punches him in the face from behind. From the outside, it looks like Nelson is the one who attacked. The guard immediately arrests him and throws him into solitary confinement. 2 days in a dark room with no light, no sense of time, with only his own thoughts, Nelson almost goes insane. When he is brought back to the cell, he is completely broken. Later, Nelson goes to a prison black market dealer and says he is exhausted with this life and wants to end all the suffering. The dealer misunderstands and thinks Nelson wants to commit suicide, so he doesn't give him meth, but instead gives him a syringe filled with poison. Nelson doesn't ask many questions and takes it back to the cell. Inside the cell, John sees the entire gang of Leonard walking toward them, so he quietly leaves. A few seconds later, the gang enters. Leonard tells his men to stay outside because he wants to deal with Nelson himself. He attacks first. Nelson tries to fight back, blocking a few punches and landing a few of his own. He climbs onto the top bunk and kicks hard, making Leonard's nose start bleeding. At that moment, the syringe filled with poison falls onto the floor. Leonard picks it up and asks what it is. Nelson says it's something that relieves stress and makes people feel amazing. Leonard believes him and injects it into himself. Within moments, he collapses. Nelson drags Leonard's body out of the cell and tells his gang that if anyone else wants to die, they can step inside. The whole group immediately backs away. Right then, John walks in and pretends to stand on Nelson's side. He calmly says that killing someone in prison will add 20 more years to the sentence. But Nelson just smiles and says he didn't kill anyone. John is surprised. Nelson grabs him and asks if he wanted him to die, but John quickly avoids the question. After that, Nelson and John walk into the cafeteria and the entire room falls silent. A member of the white gang approaches from behind. John immediately turns around with a fork in his hand, thinking a fight is about to break out, but the man only wants to shake hands. He says that Leonard had been causing trouble for the whole gang, so Nelson killing him actually solved a problem for them. From that moment, the prisoners begin to look at Nelson with respect. He has taken down the most dangerous man in the prison. John realizes that his plan is backfiring. He tries to provoke another inmate to stand up and give his seat to Nelson. The man refuses at first, but when Nelson curses right at his face, he finally leaves quietly. Later, Nelson goes into the bathroom and meets Barry again. Barry reminds him that they still have a deal. When Barry moves closer, Nelson pushes him away and punches him twice in the face. Barry angrily grabs Nelson by the throat, but Nelson calmly says that Barry once said he loved him, and in love arguments sometimes happen. The words make Barry hesitate, and Nelson even opens his arms and tells Barry to come for a hug. Just as Barry steps forward, the White Gang rushes into the bathroom. They heard that Barry was doing something wrong with their new friend, so they immediately start beating him. Nelson tries to stop them, but the guards soon arrive. This time they believe John is the one behind everything, because he is sitting in the corner watching the whole situation. As a result, John is arrested and placed in solitary confinement. When he is released, everything in the prison has changed. Nelson has become the most popular person there. He teaches karate to the inmates, tells stories that make everyone laugh, and people are always gathering around him. He even becomes the leader of the prison theater group. Later, Nelson goes to thank John. He says that without John he would never have been able to endure prison life and that John taught him how to live. Hearing this almost drives John crazy. He smashes his cell in anger. He intentionally returned to prison only to make the judge's son suffer, not to see him adapt and enjoy life there. Meanwhile, Barry and Nelson gradually become very close. One day Nelson is alone in his cell when John walks in. He begins to say that he is very proud of Nelson and of the changes Nelson has made in prison. John also mentions that tomorrow is the hearing and hopes Nelson will be released soon. In John's hand is an already opened can of soda. He gives it to Nelson and says it is a farewell gift. Nelson is slightly suspicious, so John immediately takes a sip to prove there is nothing wrong. Then he acts hurt for being doubted, and Nelson softens and drinks the entire can. But the drink contains drugs. Only a few minutes later Nelson passes out. John immediately forces himself to vomit to remove the drug from his own body, then carries out the rest of his plan. The next morning, Nelson is brought to court for the hearing. He says that prison has changed him and that he has now become a new person. On his neck is a tattoo with a Nazi symbol. Seeing the tattoos, the judges immediately deny early release and decide that Nelson must serve his full sentence. At that moment, Nelson also sees the tattoos and instantly understands who did it. When he returns to his cell, he rushes at John. The two fight violently. With his prison experience, John gradually gains the advantage and pins Nelson against the bars. At that moment, he reveals the truth that Nelson's father had sentenced him many times without giving him a chance to change, so John deliberately arranged for Nelson to be sent to this prison. Hearing this, Nelson becomes furious and smashes John's head into the metal bed frame. At that moment, the guards rush in and separate them. They decide to organize a fight in the prison yard with no rules, ending only when one of them dies. From then on, both of them are constantly monitored to make sure they do not kill each other before the match. The prisoners and guards even begin placing bets on who will win. During a visitation, Nelson meets Barry. Barry has already been released from prison but says he cannot live without Nelson and is thinking about committing a crime just to return. Nelson stops him, saying Barry is the only family he has. Barry replies that he is willing to do anything for Nelson. At that moment, Nelson suddenly comes up with an idea. Elsewhere in the city, the lawyer Dwayne is in his office when he receives a call from Nelson. Nelson asks him to help get him out of prison. Dwayne reminds him that Nelson is no longer the chairman of the Biederman Foundation and also has no money to pay legal fees. Nelson says that even though he is no longer the chairman, his son can replace him. He reveals that he has adopted a son and that person might already be in Dwayne's office. Right at that moment, Barry walks in. With his huge body, he declares that the chairman's seat now belongs to him. Not long after, the fight in the prison yard begins, which is also the opening scene of the story. John rushes forward, knocks Nelson to the ground, and rubs a piece of cloth soaked in cleaning chemicals on his face before delivering a powerful kick. Immediately after that, both of them pull out syringes filled with poison, intending to inject each other. Suddenly, Nelson suggests stopping and calling it a draw, and John agrees. But right after that, Nelson says he has learned one thing in prison: never trust anyone. Then he pushes the needle straight into John. However, before dying, John also manages to inject Nelson, and both of them collapse to the ground. The medical team arrives and declares that both men are dead. Afterward, they are buried and the power of the Biederman Foundation is handed over to Nelson's only son. But after everyone leaves the cemetery, Barry returns and digs up the grave. Nelson then steps out of the coffin, still alive. It was all part of a plan. In fact, Nelson had obtained from a prison dealer a type of drug that can make someone fall unconscious for up to 3 days. The two of them had actually injected that exact drug into each other. Barry had also bribed the medical staff beforehand with a large amount of money so they would confirm the fake deaths. Standing in front of the remaining grave, Nelson initially intends to leave John there to die, but Barry softens and persuades him otherwise. In the end, they dig John up. After a short argument, John and Nelson shake hands and bury their old hatred right there. 1 year later, we see that all of them are living fairly good lives.